Good morning, club members. We digest world-class journalism and talk it through in plain English. Here are 5 stories worth your time. A Chinese shipping company is launching the first regular container service across the Arctic Ocean. This new weekly route runs from eastern China directly to a major port in Britain. It cuts the usual 40-day sailing journey roughly in half. The firm calls this northern trade passage the Ice Silk Road. Cargo vessels will travel along the northern coast of Russia during the summer months. Rising global temperatures have melted polar ice further north than ever recorded. As a result, regular container ships can sail through without needing heavy icebreaker escorts. Traffic across this frozen route has already grown steadily over recent years. Last summer saw a record 23 ship transits along the Northern Passage. That is up from 15 voyages just 2 years earlier. Traditional maritime routes between Asia and Europe rely on southern waterways like the Red Sea. However, recent military attacks on oil tankers in the Middle East have caused severe disruptions. Those attacks pushed global oil prices above $100 a barrel last month. Shipping firms face skyrocketing insurance costs and long delays near those southern choke points. Sailing through the high Arctic allows vessels to bypass those dangerous conflict zones entirely. The much shorter distance also helps companies reduce fuel use and lower carbon emissions. Sailing through polar waters remains a highly complex operation for ocean seafarers. Satellite navigation systems often fail to function properly near the North Pole. Crews must guide giant vessels through moving ice fields without relying on GPS signals. The Russian government strictly controls access to this northern sea route. Russian officials have divided the cold waterway into 28 separate administrative sections. Foreign vessels must secure official permits from Moscow before entering any section. Global shipbuilders are already responding to this shift toward northern trade. More than 167 ice-rated cargo ships were built last year alone. Another 164 vessels are scheduled to be completed this year. Yet major European shipping lines are refusing to use the new Arctic route. Danish and European carriers pledged to stay away to protect fragile polar ecosystems. They warn that any fuel spill in freezing waters would cause catastrophic damage. Emergency search and rescue teams operate hundreds of miles away from these remote sea lanes. European executives also worry about growing political dependence on Russian regulators. Recent scientific studies show Arctic sea ice cover hit its second lowest level on record. Researchers recorded a drop of 5.8% in peak winter ice coverage. For China, shrinking ice creates a valuable new shortcut for global commerce. For Western nations, it raises deep environmental concerns and fresh security risks. The Ice Silk Road has opened, but the debate over polar shipping is only beginning. Moving from northern shipping routes to energy markets, a quiet shift in Beijing has surprised oil traders. When war broke out in Iran, analysts expected oil prices to reach $150. Fighting trapped 14 million barrels of crude inside the Persian Gulf every single day. Yet global benchmark prices stayed surprisingly stable throughout the conflict. Traditional emergency responses certainly played a role in stabilizing the market. Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi redirected 5 million barrels daily through overland pipelines. Meanwhile, governments in Washington and Tokyo released 2 million barrels a day from emergency reserves. But the most powerful market force came quietly from Beijing. Between February and June, China cut its crude oil imports by half. That removed 5.5 million barrels a day from global demand. Energy experts estimate that single decision shaved $30 off the price of a barrel. That drop matches more than half the demand lost during global pandemic lockdowns. In fact, Chinese economic growth continued smoothly throughout this entire period. China didn't buy less foreign oil because its economy was suffering. Instead, state planners managed the market using three major levers. First, China stopped filling its massive strategic storage tanks. Over the preceding year, Beijing had purchased 200 million barrels of cheap crude. That buying spree topped up national reserves to roughly 1 billion barrels. Once the war began, China simply halted those extra stockpiling purchases. Second, Chinese refiners began drawing down those brimming reserves. Over 3 months, China tapped 150 million barrels from storage. That draw supplied 1.5 million barrels a day to domestic refineries. Normally, commercial refiners must replace used stock within a month. However, state ownership allowed Chinese firms to bypass standard commercial rules. Third, central officials ordered domestic refiners to curb fuel exports to Asian neighbours. Keeping refined petrol and diesel at home protected domestic supply without fresh crude imports. For 4 decades, OPEC influenced global prices by restricting crude production among member states. But the cartel has weakened as members face production limits and internal disagreements. Furthermore, OPEC choices require agreement among more than 20 member countries. By contrast, Chinese central planners can shift global demand on the order of a single leader. By turning its massive appetite on and off, China acts much like a buyer cartel. That ability has led prominent oil traders to call China the new OPEC. Still, this strategy depends heavily on stockpiles that can't last forever. Analysts reckon China can maintain this pace for roughly 4 more months. If Gulf shipping remains blocked, Beijing will eventually reach uncomfortably low reserve levels. China will then face a difficult choice between refilling its tanks or accepting much higher energy costs. Moving to our third story, we leave oil markets behind and look at Russia. Moscow faces a growing problem with its military campaign in Ukraine. The army needs a constant supply of new recruits to keep fighting. Yet the government wants to avoid calling another mandatory public draft. The last public draft in autumn 2022 caused widespread panic. Hundreds of thousands of young men fled the country to escape service. To prevent another wave of fear, recruiters are using hidden pressure tactics. Western intelligence estimates suggest Russia loses 30,000 soldiers every month. Total casualties since the invasion began are approaching 500,000 men. These enormous losses have placed severe strain on the frontline forces. The government set a goal of 409,000 recruits this year. Local officials are under immense pressure to meet their assigned recruitment targets. Authorities offer signing bonuses of up to $56,000 for contract soldiers. That amount of money is life-changing for many people in small towns. However, even massive cash incentives are no longer attracting enough willing volunteers. As a result, recruiters are turning to coercive methods across the country. Officers are snatching men directly off the street and taking them away. They also target vulnerable citizens who face severe financial or legal troubles. People with heavy personal debts are pressured into signing military contracts to clear them. Students and criminal suspects are tricked or forced into joining up as well. Recruiters even use draft notices to intimidate political activists into military service. A secondary market of private headhunters has also appeared in recent months. These remote recruiters call random citizens to earn bonus payments for every signature. This aggressive campaign fills military rosters without a formal government draft announcement. However, it creates major operational problems for commanders on the ground. Most of these coerced recruits are sent straight to frontline combat zones. They simply replace fallen soldiers instead of forming trained reserve forces. Because of this constant replacement cycle, Russian lines remain stretched thin. Their expensive offensives yield only tiny territorial gains at a terrible cost, Independent observers report that gains have slowed to a few square miles. Military analysts believe this recruitment strategy cannot sustain the war effort forever. If forced recruitment runs out of targets, frontline units will deplete rapidly. The Kremlin may eventually face a choice between losing momentum or calling another draft. Moving to our fourth topic, we'll leave military arrests behind and look high into the sky. Most pilots fly around bad weather whenever they can. On July the 29th, a team of scientists did the exact opposite over Oregon. They flew a heavy research plane straight into a roaring storm generated by a wildfire. Firefighters call these terrifying clouds firestorms or pyrocumulonimbus clouds. They form when intense heat from a wildfire pushes warm air and moisture upward at extreme speed. Heavy smoke rushes up with the air and clogs the cloud from the inside. That thick smoke prevents normal rain droplets from forming properly. Instead of heavy rain cooling the ground, the cloud fires off dry lightning. Ferocious winds then blow hot embers in every direction and spark new blazes miles away. The fire effectively creates its own violent weather to feed itself. Why would anyone fly a jet right into the middle of that chaos? Researchers from NASA and the American Navy want to solve three big mysteries. First, nobody knows why some large wildfires create these storms while others don't. Second, these clouds act like giant chimneys. They pump dark smoke high up into the stratosphere, about 10 kilometers above the ground. Once smoke reaches that upper atmosphere, it spreads widely and lingers for months. Tiny soot particles absorb sunlight, alter wind currents, and damage the protective ozone layer. Third, scientists need to measure how much this trapped smoke warms the planet over time. To capture data from every angle, the team deployed 3 separate layers of equipment. Mobile radar trucks probed the underside of the storm from ground level. The research plane collected air samples right inside the billowing cloud. At the same time, a specialized NASA plane monitored the smoke plume from far above. This initial test flight went according to plan. Yet scientists still face major unanswered questions as summer fires worsen. In July, France even recorded its first firestorm on record. Without better data, weather models can't predict when a wildfire will turn into a monster storm. After flying into wildfire storms, our final story turns to a very different kind of heat. It is the heat inside giant computer servers that power artificial intelligence. Almost every major language model today relies on a single technology called a transformer. Researchers created this system 9 years ago, in the summer of 2017. It works by comparing every single word in a text block with every other word. That mathematical process allows a computer to understand context with high accuracy. However, the math grows quickly when a text gets longer. A document with 10,000 words requires 50 million separate multiplication steps. Because of those calculations, running these systems takes massive amounts of electricity. One leading creator expects to spend $50 billion on computing power this year alone. International energy experts also predict that data centers will double their power consumption by 2030. The problem is getting worse, because modern models are taking on harder work. Users now want systems to read whole books, scan huge code bases, and solve complex problems. To reason carefully, many models now write hidden notes to themselves as they work. All those notes add even more text for the system to process. As models grow, the transformer design has become a severe bottleneck. What started as a great strength is now holding back the industry. That slowdown has created an opportunity for a new wave of ambitious startups. Younger tech companies are now racing to build better alternative architectures. One promising idea replaces full word comparisons with a method called sparse attention. Instead of checking every single word pair, sparse attention checks only essential pairs. This reduces the mathematical workload without losing the underlying meaning of the text. Other teams are testing liquid neural networks that adjust instantly to new data flows. These new designs could make artificial intelligence models faster, cheaper, and far more efficient. Older tech giants have built huge businesses around the current design. Smaller startups have far less to lose, so they are taking the biggest risks. The next generation of artificial intelligence might look very different from the current one. That brings us to the end of today's stories. Thank you for sharing your breakfast with me, and I will see you tomorrow morning.